I would like to introduce you first, Laura Paddison from UK. She is now a journalist at the Huffington Post, and until recently she was an editor of The Guardian, and she led a sustainable business division there, which covers environmental, economic, social impacts of business. And she has written a lot about and commissioned on a wide range of topics, including the environmental and social impacts of fashion, of the fashion industry, supply chain, accountability, and consumer behavior. And Laura has always been concerned with fashion industry, and her texts go far beyond the aesthetic surface of fashion. And in a statement she says, this can also be found in the booklet, with its twisting, complex supply chains, the fashion sector has serious transparency and traceability problems. Fashion journalists have the responsibility to explore these broader implications, helping people connect what they were with how it is made and who makes it. And welcome, Laura. Please come and take one of the chairs, whatever you like. Next on the panel, Katharina Pfannkuch. She earned her master's degree in Islamic Studies from University of Leipzig in Germany in 2011. And after graduation, she worked in a lawyer's office in Dubai before she started working as a freelance journalist. She has written about the recent developments in Egypt and Tunisia, and through this, she in important outlets like Spiegel Online, Zeit Online, or Die Welt, so all very reputable German newspapers or online websites. And after working on the growing industry of modest fashion, especially for Muslim women, she turned her focus to fashion journalism. And today she contributes to the fashion and lifestyle departments of Frankfurter Allgemeine, Die Welt, Zeit Magazin Online, Spiegel Online, and many others. So again, very reputable German newspapers and online news. And in her statement she says, fashion journalism is more than writing about the latest collection and trends in glossy magazines. Fashion journalists cannot only escape the powers of marketing, but is also able to raise awareness on social responsibility on the fashion industry. Welcome, Katharina Pfannkuch. And next is Arne Lynge-Jorlen. It's a bit difficult to pronounce, but she says, doesn't matter. She's used to it, so it's a very, yeah. Arne is a fashion scholar and has a PhD in fashion studies from the University of Arts in London. She is the author of the monograph entitled Niche Fashion Magazines, so she is more from the academic side. She's working scientifically on fashion journalism. Currently, she is a visiting research fellow at the Department of Fashion Studies at Lund University in Sweden, where she works on a project on experimental fashion stylists and examines the history, culture, economy, and practice of styling for fashion magazines. And yeah, as I said earlier, she represents a scientific perspective on media and fashion. And welcome, Arne, please. Aya Noel from Brussels. Aya holds a BA and MA in comparative literature from the University of Paris-Sorbonne and an MA in fashion journalism at Central St. Martin's in London. In her final thesis, she has developed deep interest on the way sustainability is communicated through fashion media. She's currently working as an online editor of One Granary, a platform founded by students of Central St. Martin's Royal College of Arts in London, Parsons in New York, and the Royal Academy of Fine Arts Fashion Department in Antwerp. And her claim is fashion journalism should go beyond the consumerist approach. And we are very, very curious about your opinion. Please, Aya. Just to begin the conversation, my first question would be, what exactly is fashion journalism? I mean, we all know it perhaps, but if we start to define it, maybe it becomes more complicated. So what is the distinctiveness of fashion journalism in comparison to other resorts, in your opinion? Maybe, Aya, you can make the beginning.
I didn't want to start with this one. I think the difficulty in defining what fashion journalism is that there are so many platforms and so many different ways to approach fashion. And for example, I specialize in independent designers and very young designers, which is a completely different world from what how most consumers relate to fashion, which would be, I think, high street. But I think the problem is when fashion is only related to how we consume and how we shop fashion, and fashion journalists as the guides through this shopping experience, this is when there's a problem.
And Arne, what would you say from a perspective of academia?
I don't know, it's a very broad question, and I think sort of ontological, what is fashion journalism? Does it entail fashion criticism, fashion writing? How do you define the practice of writing on fashion from a journalistic point of view? There's no one answer. I think it's very important that we sort of try and flesh out the complexity of the field today, that we don't talk about fashion writing as just one thing. Well, I am a scholar, but I also write on fashion for different media. But I wouldn't label myself as a fashion journalist because I'm not trained as a journalist. I'm a fashion critic. But what is that then? And so I think sort of reporting, writing on, criticizing, it's so many different things. And as Aya said, different approaches and avenues to the topic. I think it's a very complex, and what's so brilliant about it in a way, if we should start off on a positive point, is that it's uncharted territory. There's still so many things to be developed within fashion journalism.
Okay, maybe we can approach this a bit more by thinking about, are there any no-goes in fashion journalism? Anything that really does not belong to it because it's something completely different? Sometimes you learn more about what a thing is when you think about what it is not. Maybe Laura.
Well, I think I agree with Anna that there's so many different platforms, and what's journalism and who's making the journalism. It's not just newspapers, it's this online publications, it's bloggers, it's Instagram stars, it's everybody. And I think in terms of no-go areas, as much as anything, I don't think there is. I think there's a certain sort of strand of fashion journalism. There's the aesthetic appeal. There's the joy in that on the positive note, kind of expressing who you are through fashion. But there's also that obligation to look at the broader impacts. So I don't think there should ever be no-go areas. I think it's important that there are kind of go-to areas that perhaps aren't necessarily being covered right now, such as the social impact and environmental impact as part of a broader discussion about fashion within journalism.
Okay, Katharina, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would agree that there are no-go areas, which is why I'm so interested in fashion journalism. If we somehow find a definition of what fashion journalism even is, but this is, to me, the very interesting aspect, that there are no-go areas, no restrictions, because fashion is related to daily life of everyone. It's related to politics, to society, to environment, to almost every aspect of our daily life. So I don't think that there are any no-go areas. Maybe there are media outlets, platforms where not every issue can be treated appropriately. That's possible, of course, but that doesn't mean that there are no-go areas.
I maybe have a no-go area, if I could.
Yeah.
I think that every writing or journalism is only good if you write about what you're specialized in. And so I think that the best writing will come if you take the angle of your specialization. And I think what I think is the reason that social issues or environmental issues are covered so little is that when they are in fashion journalism, it's done by people who know nothing on the topic but try to approach it from an environmental angle. And I don't know if you've ever read an article on a sustainable label written by a fashion journalist who tries to get technical, it's super boring and it's completely, it's impossible to understand even. And I don't think it's the fault of the journalist, it's just when you write about something that's not your specialization, you'll just take whatever technical terms the website hands to you. So I think that social issues can be covered, but the angle should still be from fashion if we're talking about a pure fashion magazine, of course.
And if you say that you shouldn't overstep your areas of expertise, I mean, who are fashion journalists? Do you know anything about their academic backgrounds, age, gender? Can you say anything about that? Anyone?
Again, let's not generalize. I think, you know, there are now courses at university in the UK, in particular, where you can train to become a fashion journalist. But then, obviously, there's, you know, a different strand of people, different group of people who are indeed specialists who write on fashion. So whether you come from, you know, with the specialist insight and you bring that and your methodology is writing about fashion, or you're trained as a general journalist and then you know, try and learn as much as possible about fashion to write about it using your journalistic skills. I don't know if there's a difference in those two avenues and approaches.
I think all of you, or almost all of you, claim that fashion journalism should go beyond the mere aesthetic appreciation of fashion. So should it go beyond? Can it go beyond? And if so, in which directions? Maybe Laura?
Yeah, absolutely it should. Yes, as with all forms of journalism, and it's not just fashion journalism, you could say the same about sports journalism, you know, that's got an environmental and social impact, and those things are covered and should be covered. Yes, I think it should. I don't necessarily think it's up to fashion journalists to go and do big investigations, but it's up to them to reflect the fact that those have happened. And I think as we start to feel these impacts more, these climate change impacts, and we start to see more about social impacts, it's imperative upon people who are reporting about fashion to reflect that, at least acknowledge that. And I think a lot of that is happening already. And I do take your point about the specialisms. Sometimes you read an article about, look, this brand new technology is going to change the world. It's made out of apple peel and all your clothes will be like that. And it's just not true. You know, we have to kind of take a proper look at this. So I think there is definitely space for specialism, but I think it's important that people who are sort of specialised in a certain kind of fashion journalism still open themselves up to talk about those things, because it's vital and it's only going to get more so.
Okay.
May I add something? I also think it should go beyond, but it already goes beyond. I think it really depends on where you look for journalism about fashion. It's not that of course, you find different ways of approach when you look into Vogue, for example, but you will find in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for example, also fashion journalism from a very different approach. They apply different standards, not better or worse, but they're different. So I think this is already happening. Maybe, of course, it can always be more, but I think it really depends on where you look, where you want to get your information from.
I also think it's just, I don't think it's that easy to separate the aesthetics from what's beyond, because anything that's truly beautiful or that creates an emotional reaction with the person wearing it, it's always because there's a story behind it. And I don't think you can just say, oh, this is purely the aesthetic. I don't think there's an aesthetic without a story behind it. And so it's not, should we go behind the aesthetic? It should be, we should go and explain why this is beautiful and what makes this beautiful. And I think anything that is made in good conditions and properly researched and has been thought about the design, that is the true beauty, and that is real fashion. And I think it's unsustainable fashion that is not real fashion.
Just to add, I mean, the days of the golden age of haute couture in the 40s and 50s, where fashion reporting really developed, sort of hemline journalism, fashion journalism, those days are in a way over. And I think this is also a reflection of the growing structural recognition of fashion that fashion is something that has perhaps struggled to gain legitimacy within the field of culture, that has been this stigmatized little sister to fine arts and what have you, literature. And now, hopefully, that's what I'm sensing, both globally and locally in Denmark, where I'm based, that fashion has become more confident in a way, and as a result, the people reporting on the topic are acknowledging the multifaceted nature of fashion. So fashion is a prism through which we can, unpack economy, social impacts, aesthetics, diversity, and so on.
Sorry, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There was a big survey at The Guardian quite recently which looked at blocked comments and the kind of journalism they related to. So people who'd made inappropriate comments that breached standards. And journalism was the top, fashion journalism was the top recipient of these blocked comments, which just shows there is still a massive stigma around fashion journalism, and it's suggested it's frivolous and it's silly, and I think there's a sort of sexism that's inherent in that. And I think I agree with all the panelists that it does take in broader things, that fashion journalism can be brilliant, and it often is. So it is kind of worth sort of appreciating it for what it is as well.
But it can also be appalling.
It can.
It can also be that sort of dumbing down, speaking to the lowest common denominator, recipe format journalism, imperative tone of voice, buy this, believe the hype, and so on. Yeah. That's still a very big sort of way of approaching fashion in the media, at least if we talk about mainstream fashion journalism.
I would like to come back to this idea of going beyond aesthetic appreciation and maybe explain a bit more what we mean about it. I think you're right that real aesthetics also need good stories and need to make, in our terms, we would say, would need to make good associations. So, for instance, the story of the traditional trapper who delivers the fur for the Canada Goose coat. So this would be maybe a robust aesthetic appreciation. But what about the hidden links or the missing links? What about the stories that remain untold? Is this also something fashion journalism should be interested in looking behind or going beyond these associations that most of them are forged by marketing departments, of course? And
this is a really difficult question because if I say no, I don't think fashion journalism should cover it, it's almost saying that those issues aren't important, which isn't true. But I think it depends on your platform and it depends on your reader. And I think that in glossy magazines, those stories of labor issues, for example, or global warming, they kind of have a shock effect, but I don't think those type of stories really change consumer culture in any way, because that is just not what the reader expects and what the reader needs. It will be, I think a good example was that Marie Claire did this summer a sustainability issue, and it was their green issue, and it was all, the theme was almost save the planet. And they approach it as, oh, fashion is really glamorous, but there's a dark side that nobody wants to talk about. And then talking about sustainable fashion is about opening this dark side and unleashing the Pandora's box and showing all the gruesome stories for one issue and then closing it again and putting it away. And I don't think that works at all. I think either you have to regularly report on it, and that is the job of investigative journalism. But if you're a glossy magazine, a female magazine, I think it's more about incorporating a sustainable thinking and a new approach to fashion every month of the year. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, anyone else who?
I would not complete 100% with you, because I think, again, the shocking effect, what you were talking about, I think it can definitely have a good impact. Like in Germany, we have this magazine Grazia, and they had a story about the working conditions in Bangladesh. And I read this magazine also from time to time, and I would never have expected a story like this there in this magazine. And for me, it was really like a wake-up call. So, okay, even them, I don't want it to be sound arrogant or something, but if even they report about this, so just start now thinking about what you are buying. So on me personally, it really had an impact. And also I think if you have so many glossy magazines, they report, for example, on alternative materials like hemp, for example. So I think it's good when stories like this also come into the mainstream media, the glossy mainstream media, the maybe superficial glossy media. I think it's really good.
I don't agree, because what is the impact of that story? You might like it, you might think about it that moment, but how much impact do those stories really have? Has Primark sales gone down since that story? I don't think so, especially not if on the next page you have 5 lists of buy these items underneath €3. So it should be incorporating this narrative on every page and not just on the shock story.
Can I just add, I think, are we talking about tokenism here? I think the butterfly effect of what you're talking about, Katharina, it is effectful if we were to not cover anything, just sort of saying, well, we can just cover it for this story as this token gesture. I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of education that journalism and writing can offer. I guess that's what also that taps into what you're saying about the grant share example.
I think it's difficult. It's difficult to change consumer behaviour because it's not necessarily rational. You know, you can read about all these things and think that's terrible, but then do you translate it into what your actions are when you're standing in front of some clothes? You're thinking about price and you're thinking about how it looks and you're thinking about how it make you feel. You're not necessarily thinking about the impacts further down the chain. I think it's so hard to change the way people behave. And so I do think it's important to have those stories. And I think there's a cumulative effect. And you could compare it, say, with food and how people feel about free range and organic and how attitudes slowly change as things become more apparent. But also filling, you know, a one-off edition, what's that going to do? And that makes it feel like something separate when it's not separate. It's so embedded in everything that's to do with fashion. And also you don't want to be too negative, because if you're too negative, people shut down and go, well, there's nothing I can do, we're all doomed, I'm just going to go and buy all those Primark t-shirts. So it's really hard to get the message right, but I think that the message needs to be there, and it needs to be there as part of everything. So you're looking at brands that are stylish, which there are many, stylish and sort of ethical. So yeah.
May I add just one point? I'm not really sure if it's the task of journalists to behave to change the behavior of the consumers. I think it's our task to inform them about possibilities, alternatives, but I think it would be really dangerous if we tell ourselves, okay, now it's my task to tell you and you how you should shop or not shop. I think that's dangerous.
So maybe I'm taking an extra leap, but I guess what I'm saying is to talk about the impacts, to make that known, rather than actively going out. So that's a campaigner's job. But I just mean kind of expressing that side of things is important. Yeah.
But as journalists, we do have power and we do have influence, and so we have to question ourselves how we use it. And so you're always going to influence readers when you say, look at these amazing shoes, in the ideas that they buy them, or when you say, oh, this was the most amazing collection, this was the most brilliant designer, in a way you are influencing what they buy or how they want to dress.
That's the luxury of an independent journalist, but you know, at the end of the day, it's the commissioning editor and the publisher as well that has the power in terms of what they will cover. And I think that's sort of a structural level that we should address as well, the valuing of fashion journalism and what stories are selected, the stories that can potentially down the line change consumer behavior.
And what is your estimation about the more structural level? I mean, all of you emphasize that fashion journalism has already changed tremendously and should perhaps change even more. And should take on board many more issues than just the aesthetic appeal of fashion. But of course, you were also invited here because you were kind of ahead of maybe broader movement. But how if you talk about fashion journalism in average, or if you talk about the more powerful positions within fashion journalism, like the chief editors of the major journals and so on, what would be their main opinion about that?
It's a very broad question. I think it's very important that we don't make assumptions and generalize, because it's such a big difference between a broadsheet and a glossy paper in terms of how they run and how much in the pocket of the advertisers they are and how much independence they have. I think what I meant about the structural or the valuing of the work that I said before was to do with, being a freelance fashion critic. What are you paid for your jobs? How are you protected in your job? And I know that I might be digressing a little bit, but the valuing of the people producing the work as well, I think, is a reflection of the standing and the ranking of the reporting on fashion.
Another term you just mentioned is this term of independence, and of course fashion journalism is an intermediary activity connecting sellers to consumers. And how independent would you say are fashion journalists from the big brand owners? I mean, you rely on them to an extent, and it is of course a long-term relationship, so we have to take care. How independent is fashion journalism?
Not at all, I would say. I think, especially if you work for a fashion magazine who depend entirely on advertising to survive, you're basically being paid directly by the people who you're supposed to write about. And even if you aren't, even if a brand isn't directly responsible for your paycheck, there's still in fashion always this fear of being locked out and not being invited to fashion shows anymore, and your access to the information, or that's the idea we have, is dependent as well on the people you write about. So you're almost scared to say something mean out of fear of losing your access to the world.
I think there's, at least in Germany, in German media, there's a difference between magazines and newspapers.
Yeah.
Because also for the newspapers, for example, you don't only write about, I don't know, the latest fashion show on the next season, but you write about, cultural backgrounds of the new silhouette and where is this coming from and why, things like this. So there you are much more independent, of course, and also at least the newspapers. I don't want to say something about the magazines because I don't work for them, but the newspapers, they have very strong restriction on this lines between advertisement and content. So I think the independence at the newspapers, it's on a very high level in German media.
I agree. The same in Denmark. When I was a fashion critic for Danish broadsheet, it was almost expected of me to be critical of fashion. And that might be a rare case, and that's surely not something we associate with fashion journalism generally. But when it comes to newspapers, hopefully we can say that independence still stands.
It does, but there's also something to be said about the model for journalism dying and advertising becoming more and more important. And I hope that doesn't mean that that's then reflected in a lack of independence. But I agree. I mean, I worked at a quality broadsheet, and there is a strict independence and integrity with what you're doing. But I also agree there must be elements of it where maybe you're not feeling you're being swayed, but you have to be careful because you want to maintain access. So that's where the danger lies.
Yeah, I think those lines you talk about in magazines, they're completely blurred. Even independent magazines, I'm speaking for London now, magazines that really have the image of being underground or anti-establishment in a way, every page is paid for, and even editorial spreads. It's often brands who pay for the whole production of the shoot in exchange for having their full looks or their clothes. I have a friend who works at Harper's Bazaar, and she said they are now introducing new technology that measures exactly on each page how much space a product takes. So if we have the Dior handbag, that's 1/4 of the page. Dior will pay 1/4 And so every single space on a page, if you open a bigger glossy magazine, even a little bracelet that's in a corner, that is paid for. And I think that is the main issue on why there isn't enough criticism towards the industry in mainstream fashion media.
And even the industry, sometimes the actors of the industry are not aware of those differences, because I have made very often the experience that people from brands or labels try to tell me what I'm going to write about them, and then I try to explain them, no, I'm a journalist and I write my article and I won't show it to you before it's going online. And they are completely confused, but that's not normal. So you really obviously you have to explain them that there's
I'm not your PR.
fashion journalism and fashion journalism. Yeah, that's...
But it's so worrying how that happens across lots of different kinds. That's definitely not just a fashion thing, but it's terrifying when a company goes, oh, can I have a look at the article before you publish it, just to check? And you're like, no.
But I feel in fashion that people think it's really more normal to really demand for this. Politicians, of course, they try and they want you to show it before, but fashion people are really expecting it, so... There's a lot of work to do. Yeah.
And there is definitely danger with, speaking for the younger generation, of not being trained with journalistic standards, because my whole team is very young. We recently interviewed somebody where it happened that they wanted to check the article and they completely changed the article. It was basically a press release. And then later we interviewed Kathy Horan and we told her the story, and she said, well, why didn't you just say no? And we were like, you can say no? But, oh, yes. And it sounds really simple and stupid now, but if you're young, it's really easy. It's even easier to be impressed by these bigger brands. And so there is a lack, I think, of journalistic training within the industry. And even I studied fashion journalism at Central St. Martin's. We never spoke about those kind of issues. It was more about like how to write, how to describe a jacket in the right way. But these structural problems were never talked about in my class.
One of the biggest eye-openers during our project was really to disenchant, disenchant, I'm not really sure if maybe this is a too big word, but to look behind the scenes of brands. So brands, of course, claim distinctiveness. And brands is what you encounter when you enter shops. And of course, these distinct brands also suggest that you have a choice. You know, you can choose between traditional product and a vegan product or ecological fair product. And so there is a kind of illusion that you can change something by making the right choices. But if you look behind the scenes, often all the three brands you can choose between belong to the same firm. So it's just the decision if you put the money in the left hand or in the right hand of the same person. Is there any awareness of these of the working of brands in fashion journalism, and also are there any attempts to go beyond comparing brands?
I think it's important that we acknowledge that readers today are more literate than perhaps previous generations. I think a huge amount of readers are actually aware readers, that that we shouldn't dumb them down, we shouldn't assume that they know nothing, because I was just reading the Business of Fashion magazine on my way here, and there's a whole report of a large survey into Generation Z, I believe it's called, how, aware this generation is, that is a lot younger than I am, in terms of the behind the scenes of fashion. That's sort of just the reader perspective and not so much the producer perspective.
Okay. So this seems to be an issue, I think, in fashion journalism. All of you also talked about the radical changes going on in the media sector. I mean, there are, of course, this whole major topic of digitalization, blogs, laypersons journalism, users becoming opinion leaders, everything. Recently, I read this other notion that we have an era of media nihilism. So there's a kind of major mistrust on any published opinion or any published information. It's all fake, so don't trust the media. What is your opinion about these radical changes? What opportunities do they provide, but also what dangers or what risks do they entail? Anyone?
That's a big question. I think it's great that the media landscape opens up. I think it's great that people can become publishers and tell stories, and there's a diversity of voice there that perhaps there hasn't ever been before, and that's so important to have. Definitely, there's a huge mistrust of the media, and that needs to be remedied because, quite frankly, it's frightening. When people don't trust quality journalism, I mean, where are you then? But in terms of opening up the sort of the broader landscape, I think that's a really interesting development, and I think it will be interesting to see how that reflects in how fashion journalism sort of evolves and the kind of issues that they think are important and the kind of issues that are coming to the fore. And as I said earlier, it's important that when we're talking about journalists and we're talking about the media, we're talking about so many different things, from your kind of high quality journalism in broadsheets and some certain magazines right down to someone who's just gutter journalism essentially. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people understand and can appreciate things, and I think we shouldn't, as you were saying, dumb down, that people can understand what they're reading. But yeah, it is a diverse landscape, which is why I think this conversation is hard, because we're talking about media as sort of this one thing, and it's just not, and we're all coming from slightly different perspectives.
I'd just like to add, my research on Niche Fashion Magazine showed that all of us, or the group of people I spoke to, of course I shouldn't enlarge that survey, but we use different media for different purposes. So although I might have, I might favor a certain type of niche fashion magazine, but I also have a guilty pleasure of reading Heat, just to show that I think, that we are aware of our different media practices, and we are aware of, we sort of demand transparency in terms of how that discourse is produced and how we co-produce that discourse as writers and journalists.
And I think one strand of discourse is, of course, also a strand of a crisis of the profession of journalism. So if everybody can produce news and everybody can have a public opinion, and quality journalism is no longer a trademark that people trust in, then of course your position as a professional journalist weakens. Or do you perceive it differently?
Yes, sorry. I think the fact that everyone can have a public opinion, as you said, that urges professional journalism just to get better, to prove every day that being a journalist means something. I mean, I have respect for every blogger in the world, but being a blogger does not mean that you are a journalist. There are bloggers who become journalists, or bloggers who want to be journalists. Not every blogger wants to be one, because you have a blog to write about your personal opinion from your personal perspective. This is exactly what a journalist, if it's not a fashion critic, what a fashion journalist should not do. So I think that's the most important aspect, that social media and the blogosphere, all those new opportunities, urges and forces you to get better in your work, in your professional journalistic work.
Yeah, I agree.
They coexist, and you just need to sharpen your pen.
Okay, maybe it's time to open up discussion and to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions. Yeah, there's the first question right here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Okay. It's not perfectly formed, more of a commentary, I think. We were talking about sustainability as tokenism. This reminds me that sometimes sustainability articles, but also brands, make leverage out of people's guilt. We are all the more aware today that every time we drink from a bottle of plastic, that plastic is going to poison us, it's going to poison the world, the oceans. Every time we do a washing machine, something bad happens. And when we write, I think not so often we specify this fact. My editor asked me recently to write about Stella McCartney did a campaign on a landfill. She shot her clothes on a landfill. And I'm sure that Stella McCartney was advertising in the magazine when my editor asked me to write that. And these kind of campaigns, I think I mean, it's hard because they are still promoting consumption. So, you know, you showed me clothes that I may want to buy, but you're also showing me the effect that they have on the environment at the same time. So it's really, I don't know, it was hard for me to write that piece because obviously it's better to show, or like recently when Vetman did some window in some big department store in New York, and it was filled with clothes to also overconsumption, and Vivienne Westwood also talks about this all the time. Yeah, I feel like sometimes when you make leverage out of people guilt, you can become something of a green fuel, you know, to keep the industry running. And I was wondering what was your opinion on this.
I think Stella McCartney is a perfect example of somebody who uses sustainability as a communication tool and as a branding tool. And I know that she's researching a lot in innovative materials, and she's constantly looking for sustainable ways to design. But on the other side, if you look behind the curtain, you will find that, of course, it doesn't add up, and what she does good, she adds in the bad side as well. But I think for an example like her, all you can do is hope that it creates some kind of awareness and some kind of change in image, because that is something sustainable fashion is really struggling with. It's the perception, the image. So that you can find some hope there. But it's true, I think then besides writing about her, I think that is a problem, that we need to find a way to connect to fashion in fashion media outside of consumption.
Yeah, the thing is that the closed loop is still a myth. There is no clothing item that it's better that it exists rather than it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So all of the sustainable brands in the end, and I don't know, I feel like there is this kind of conflict.
Yeah, it's true.
I can't help but think about sort of the ontology again, about the ontology of fashion journalism. How does this differ from culture journalism? Because culture journalism also entails reviewing Nick Cave's new album, cultural events, products, etc. So should we then define what consumption is? Mm-hmm. You know, fashion journalism is given stick for being so permeated in consumer interests, and that's sort of, it deserves that on the larger scale. But I think there's a structural discussion that we still need to have in order to address what the responsibilities, if they have any, what the responsibility of fashion journalism is.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and I take your point, because you look at a fast fashion company like H&M, who's done a lot around getting people to recycle their clothes. They had this €1 million recycling prize. They're putting money into technology, but yet they're opening a store every day, and they're changing their collections every other week. And it's just not tackling it at the source of the problem. It's not real, true sustainability. It's not closed loop, as you were saying. I think it's hard because you say, as with sort of Stella McCartney, I think it was rated like 53% of her collection was sustainable. So she's getting there, but she's definitely not there, but she's on the way. And I think there's a sense that there's a celebration in that, while also admitting that we're not there yet at all with that. And you look at companies like Patagonia with their sort of "don't buy this" campaign. You know, buy one thing that's really expensive, that's really well made, that we have the technology to recycle and repurpose. That's really interesting. And yeah, they're a clothes company. They still need to sell clothes to survive.
I remember reading that campaign actually spiked their sales.
Yeah.
You know, obviously people are interested, and even H&M with the recycling, they were doing this thing in which you brought your old clothes to the shop and they will give you a 70% discount on new purchases.
Yeah, exactly. We'll encourage you to buy more. Yeah, it's difficult, but I don't think that means we shouldn't acknowledge the moves that are being made and the steps that are being taken.
Okay, are there any more comments or questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hello. I think it's interesting that discussion immediately turned to sustainable fashion, that kind of weird oxymoronic construction, which is urgent but is still construction. When value in fashion, I think, is so much wider, you know, the creative potential of fashion and, yeah, so much more in a way. So I thought that was interesting. That's just a comment. And something you touched on just a little bit, Aina, but, you know, the responsibility or the role of fashion media in making fashion so fast, in constantly discursively constructing not just fast fashion, but trends. So that sort of inextricable relationship between the fashion system, as problematic as it is, as we have it today, and fashion media. But now to my question, I would be interested, because you're obviously all on the kind of good side of fashion writing. And it might have been interesting to have some people who are kind of more on the commercial side, but yeah, all really interesting contributions, I think. But I don't know if it's possible, but could you say something about your prerogative in writing about fashion? It's a bit like, you know, what's the sense of your life question, but do you know what I mean? Sort of professionally, do you have a prerogative in writing about fashion?
I think being independent, you have the luxury of choosing what to write on. So, you know, you can pitch stories that are not permeated in economic interests to your independent title. I think it was interesting what you said about sort of the fashion system, and it made me think about Barthes, who wrote about the fashion system and the power of the written word. And surely today that's not the case with the, you know, the current camera culture. We have a different and more complex system of valuing in fashion, but surely fashion media has become so powerful and so geared towards consumers in a different way. But I would say, just to answer your question, I think, you know, as freelancers, I guess we all more or less freelancers. We have the luxury of choosing what we will write on.
Yeah, and I was an editor at The Guardian, so I wrote and mostly edited there. And for me, it was kind of, when I was commissioning something, it was making sure that we were interrogating it, making sure that we had integrity and independence, and we were going out to external experts. So you're not just swallowing. And I think a lot of the kind of journalism around, look at this great big new technology that's going to save us, or look at this brand that's going to save us, doesn't really interrogate beyond that. And I don't mean it has to be, you know, a 2,000-word thesis, but I think we have a responsibility to talk to people who are more expert than us to understand these issues. And also for me at The Guardian, a part of my journalism was about looking to solutions. So again, there's never one solution, but having some kind of positive message that came across, because we were covering kind of environment and social impact, it can get very negative. So it's looking to what can be done about these things over the short term, over the long term.
I'm not sure what the word prerogative means, but you're asking, why am I doing what I do? Is it?
The aim, in a way, of
Yeah.
when you write about fashion, sort of what's your goal or what's
I think what attracts me to this job is still just the beauty of creation and talking to designers and just talking about the ideas that they put into their clothes and the reason why they create that is just a force that is so powerful, I think, and then to also relate that to the people who wear it and the love people have for clothes and talking to people about their clothes and what they do in their clothes and, you know, what they wore to their graduation or the sweater of their grandma they got and why they love it so much and why the design is so good. All of these stories are what really fascinates me, and that is why it's also so frustrating not to see them represented in fashion media. To see them barely represented. And I also think that when you talk to independent designers, younger designers, this love is so clear and it's so different from what we consider mainstream fashion that it's really frustrating not to see that. represented.
Hello, so thank you for your interesting perspectives. I have a question for Anne, because there was a lot of talk on this panel about the commercial publications financed by ads, and then the necessity to talk positively about those brands. But then you also said something about the necessity of the critic, of being critical about fashion. So do you think that being tied to these independent papers that are subsidized by institutions would also confine you in your means of expression? So have you identified any gray areas where the fashion critic can have a freedom of expression at all?
Well, I think there are different types of niches, and I think we need to acknowledge that obviously, as Aya said, that obviously niche fashion magazines are supported by advertising revenue as well. But if we look beyond that, there are magazines like Bestoy that find different types of sponsorship that will allow them to maintain their independence. So I think it's a matter of looking beyond, you know, what's sort of in your proximity, because there are independent voices, and surely, as again, in the broadsheets, those can be found.
Can I add something? I think it's quite interesting that we are going back, or dividing sort of journalism into a good camp and a bad camp. And
Yeah, we were the good ones.
and as someone who's often been tempted to do the same, since I do edit this journal that Ane just mentioned, Bestoy, I've started thinking more and more about the role we each have ourselves, like to try and become more self-reflective even. I find that when you divide fashion media into glossy magazines supported by advertising, i.e. which cannot be independent, and the broadsheets allegedly not supported by advertising, which of course isn't the case anymore either. So hence the independence that we then hold those newspapers up to, or these independent journalists that some of you identify as being, and as I also have identified as being, I think it's not at all that simple anymore. I mean, a newspaper like The Guardian, for example, and just like every other newspaper, has supplements full of advertising. I mean, every single journalist out there, at least the ones that I have come into contact with, we all want to think that we're independent. There's not one of us that would openly admit to others or ourselves that we have compromised here, there, and everywhere. But at the same time, we do. I mean, it's not just in the overt ways that Aya was talking about earlier. My editor tells me to change this article to become more like a press release, and I didn't realize I could say no. But rather in much more covert ways. You know, the access we mentioned earlier, you know, wanting to appear good in front of somebody that you admire and that you're flattered took the time to see you, you know. Things that we do that we hide from ourselves often in order to uphold this self-image of being independent, which for any journalist is crucial. And I wondered, because I feel that the panel has taken a little bit of a us and them type approach, if any of you could share personal experiences where you have had or have felt or have really had to consider a choice that you made at the time or in retrospect, where perhaps this independence that you otherwise would ascribe to yourself has either been compromised, or where you've had to think differently or shift those boundaries a little bit, because often they are quite permeable.
Well, saying no to perks. I think, you know, staying true to the idea of independence, that you run the risk of being an outcast. And that's a very lonely place to write from, but I think it's still doable.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Or broadsheets are supported by advertising as well, and advertisers will seek to exert pressure. I know that there was an advertiser on The Guardian that wrote about that sort of wrote in about something that we'd written, and you push back, and you push back, and you push back, and you just, you know, for me, it's the most important thing that I can stand up and say I've got integrity. If you're talking about personal biases, of course everyone does. And maybe sometimes we make subconscious decisions one way or another. But it's kind of, for me, it's always about checking myself and thinking I write and commission about what I want to, and knowing that there might be repercussions and it's going to be difficult. I'm not saying I'm a saint, but it's at all. But I don't agree that I, as a journalist, feel myself swayed into doing something or not writing about something. I also didn't, for me, I don't think it's an us and them thing. I've never written for a glossy magazine. I don't know the inside world of that. I've only written for The Guardian and now the Huffington Post, so it's a bit different. I'm not a fashion journalist by trade, so I don't know about that world. But, yeah.
But my point is that everybody thinks like that. I mean, we all think, at least I'm sure in this room, like that we are the kind of journalists that, you know, would always say no to perks, that would always uphold our ethics and our integrity. But if that was the case, fashion journalism we wouldn't be having this conversation. So my point is that, I mean, instead of, and I don't mean to pick on the four of you on the panel necessarily, and perhaps there's, you know, I'm on the panel later, so there's always an opportunity to give back. But my point is that I don't know how far we can get if we only ever say, I'm doing it right, but you are doing it wrong. Isn't it more effective, and isn't it easier to change our own behavior rather than to try and change somebody else's? And that then would mean really thinking, okay, well, I might think I always do things, you know, to the highest ethical standard. I might feel that, you know, I said no to this perfume gift or this trip or whatever, and I feel good about myself for doing so. But what about those other times when you do have that bias, you know, that's so implicit that you don't even notice it? Like, what about those times? Aren't those the times that we can, you know, look at ourselves and try and be more transparent, you know, in our own practices, rather than try and expect or assume that others should be so?
Do you want to?
Maybe just a short answer to that. I mean, of course, like you said, every newspaper depends on that people buy advertisement space, yes, but there's a difference if those clients can have influence on the content. So, because I wrote a lot about Muslim women wearing hijab in a very fashionable, modern way. And I know for sure that not every client, every advertisement client did see his picture, his ad close to an article like this, because it was like 4 or 5 years ago, but this topic was not very popular. So, but there was no one said, okay, we cannot publish this story now. With the supplements, with the magazines, of course, you're right. I had an experience with one of the glossy magazines with the publishers, and they asked me to change the story because the client don't want it to be like that. The luxury of the freelancer, I said, okay, under these circumstances, I don't want to sell you my story. I could afford it at that time. I don't know what would happen if I had less money. But I think really there are differences between newspaper, supplement, and a magazine. And in the newspapers, of course, we depend on the money, but I think the influence on the content is really restricted.
Can I just add something? The financial condition of the freelancer is also very relevant to this issue, because I've had in the past to interview people I didn't like, who didn't like me, but the magazine asked me to interview them and I needed to survive, so I've done this thing. And obviously, it's something, you don't enter into fashion journalism from an independent position at the top, you know. It's something you achieve over the years. I obviously feel like now I wouldn't do it anymore, but who knows if things go bad, and you know, and then maybe, I don't know. You know, it's not. It's a bit of a luxury to be independent. I would like to add that. Yeah, and I feel like the media in general, as over the year, found itself into a corner in some way, because it didn't, not just fashion media, but in general, it didn't used to be like that. I remember watching on YouTube some interviews with actors and actresses in the 50s, and I was surprised by how confrontational the interviewer was, like asking very difficult questions, putting them in, you know, not saying we should go back to that, but I don't think interviewers today will be as comfortable on live TV to ask the same questions.
Oh, I mean, that's been a big theme in the UK. There was a sports personality who, it turned out, had got copy control over a kind of national treasure that everybody loved, and had got copy control and been apparently a bit diva-ish over what she was doing, and that sparked a debate about how closely, and this was more about kind of entertainment interviews, how close that kind of journalism was to PRs, and how the access worked, and all the kind of complicated mechanisms for getting the interview in the first place, which meant you had to put X, Y, and Z in and send it off for copy approval. So yeah, absolutely, and that also happens in broadsheets. I mean, let's be honest, it does. So yeah, there are definitely problems, and there are problems throughout all the kinds of different journalism. I'm interested in what you think. You're saying acknowledge things. How that would happen, and what you exactly mean. I think it's a really interesting point that you're making.
What do you think?
I think it's difficult while you've still got people who are complicit in that way of working, because if you agree to work a certain way and you get the access, and most people still do that, then the incentive not to do that is not really there, if that makes sense. That it kind of takes a wholesale scandal almost. I mean, if you look at something like a completely different topic, but Weinstein, you know, sexual harassment has been going on forever in every industry, and pretty much every woman would say, yeah, me too. But it took that thing for things to start to change. I mean, I'm not saying they've changed, but for things to start to come out and people telling their stories. And I wonder if it's like there comes a tipping point. I don't know.
I also wanted to answer to Anja's question, because that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot, because I've been working as a fashion journalist for 8 months already. So, but only recently I've realized that when I'm interviewing, especially when I interview designers I really like, I'm almost writing the article for them. And I realize that I'm like, oh, I want them to really like this article. I want them to be really impressed with me, because in the end, I want to be, you know, the next Susie Menkes. I want to be a really famous fashion journalist. That's why most people do it. You want to be really good at your job and respected by the industry. And so I realize I'm like often, and it's not this overt like, that they get to edit every copy, but you kind of auto-edit the negative parts out. And then I think that maybe it's important that whenever you talk about an issue in journalism, that you do include yourself and explain, okay, where does this issue come from? If you say, oh, why are so many journalists willing to hush down on an issue if they get a free bag, and explain then from your personal perspective, oh, I've realized this as well, that it's really hard to stay 100% objective. Yeah, and then I also think it's important to accept this, that there always will be this these flaws. And for example, I was thinking of examples of media platforms that I think do it right, and somebody I really love is Man Repeller, who started as a blogger, and I think she's not going to be the person to do the investigative journalism and reveal that this brand has been has unethical labor practices, but in the way she approaches clothing, she just gives back this really humane and this love for clothes that is kind of been forgotten in other media platforms. And I think that is something really positive. And she will often on her Instagram, you will see her wear the same clothes twice and things like that. And it's really small changes, but I do think that is something to be celebrated.
My approach is slightly different. I think it's because I'm not a fashion journalist. I'm firstly a fashion scholar who writes and criticizes fashion as well in independent media. So I think I know what I'm sort of drawn to is sort of analyzing the underpinning structure, the system of valuing in fashion, the bridge between consumption and production, how things are created and are given value in a sociological perspective. So I'm not so much driven to become the new Susie Menges, but more in terms of, given an analytical insight into, sociological structures of fashion.
Hi, I've just got a kind of a comment and then a question. It seems, and I'm thinking more broadly about kind of the fashion system, and it seems that kind of permeating much of the discussion today has been a really quite depressing reading of the fashion system, where producers are exploitative, consumers are dupes who can be persuaded to buy anything, a really kind of anti-consumption rhetoric. And I think that's really sad, because we're all here presumably because we love fashion in various ways. And I think there's an enormous amount of kind of power and potential and celebration about what a fantastic industry it is. And so can we uplift it a bit?
I love fashion too. I think we all do. And I think it's a matter of choosing what you will celebrate. Renata asked what stories are we interested in covering, and I think I'm drawn to experimental fashion, conceptual fashion. That's what I tend to write on. And obviously there's so many things to unpack when it comes to fashion that is sort of transgressing into the realm of art and conception. That's just one aspect that can be, show a different angle of fashion.
Yeah, I mean, as we were saying at the beginning, there is such a positive side, obviously, to fashion journalism and fashion itself, and it's joyful and it's creative. And as others have said, it feeds into culture and art and photography and the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about society around us. I come from the perspective of an environmental, social writer. So for me, when I cover it, it's often looking at the more negative aspects, purely because I'm not a fashion critic or a fashion journalist per se. And I think you're right. I think there is, as I said earlier, if your message is relentlessly negative, then what's the incentive for action? So it's important that we say, yes, this is wonderful and this is great. But also, I think it's important that we go, this kind of consumption on these levels, they're not sustainable, and we're looking at this growing population and sort of this resource consumption. It does have to be addressed, not just in fashion, in all industries. But yes, there is a joyful side to it, yes. And I think we all would agree with that.
Yeah. And the joyful side is also the power of fashion, I think, that so many people are interested in it and so many people can be moved by it, and I think we can bring change.
And I was
through
just
that
saying earlier,
well.
we love our clothes, we adore them, we're passionate about stuff. Clothes have a real potent value, and so I think there's all sorts of different ways that we can reframe that.
We're all producers and consumers of fashion. We're producing text, but we're also, engaging productively, and so we're co-producers, but we're also consumers of fashion. I think that's sort of two hats we all wear.
Yeah, maybe we need to look to ourselves as well when we're talking about these things in the way that we think and the way that we consume, and that's a really important point.
There was another question in the back. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
sorry.
I have a question that's not actually more hinging on the negative again, but because you mentioned perks earlier, I just wanted to know, since fashion is, I'm not a journalist, I'm actually working for one of the big advertisers. So I was wondering, I know how things are staged and there's always big events, big budgets involved in maybe a cruise show or an event with an artist. So it's always nice to be there, I guess. You mentioned access before. And I just wanted to know, if that is sometimes blurry or if that makes you run into any problems, because you've mentioned Susie Menkes before, or Kathy Horan, which I clearly know have problems sometimes with these kind of perks. And I just wanted to know.
It really depends on what kind of work you're actually doing. Like for someone like me, I'm not a fashion critic, so I don't go to fashion shows and write about them after. I write about a certain issue, a certain topic, and then I take examples of designers or labels. So they don't look at me, that carefully. So they invite me, and they are nice. But it's not. I've never heard that anyone told me, why did you write this and that about me? Sometimes I say, okay, you could have been a little bit more nicer, and so, but that's fine. That works for me. But I think really it's different. I think if you are like a fashion critic or someone who works for one of the glossy magazines, I don't know. I really can't speak for myself.
I do think it's dangerous just because fashion is such a fun world to be in, and it can be so glamorous, and even going to an event, there's always nicely dressed people and nice music and champagne, and this is not an overreaction. There's always champagne, and this is really confusing, and then you're like, oh, I want to go because there might be champagne, but I'm like, are they paying me to write something nice? And I think it's impossible not to have these blurred lines. And so again, I think a solution might be to each time you write about an issue like that, admit how hard it is and how far the problem goes.
But also, I think we really can also write if there was a nice event. It's not bad at all to write. It was a beautiful evening with beautiful dresses, with creative innovations. It's not that this would be a crime or something. Of course, if there are terrible materials on the catwalk, I will say, okay, beautiful, but I'm not sure. But it's not bad to say beautiful, nice, happy.
And again, how does that differ from culture journalism? That's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
I agree.
I think there's another question.
I just thought this is actually an interesting witnessing of the value of disassociation, where you're disassociating yourselves from fashion journalism. So just as a comment, and then of course, as Anya said, it's not as black and white. It's much more grey, and I think probably everyone in this room is implicit in a fashion system of negative connotations, and it's precisely this kind of maddening complexity of fashion that it's so creative and beautiful, but at the same time can be very damaging. So that as a comment, and the question to Laura. For The Guardian, which I think is a really interesting example in the context of the UK, because I think they really moved beyond writing about fashion as just product and focusing on the processes and really highlighting some of the issues there, together with The Independent, I think probably the most important broadsheets there. But you have both happening sort of within the same issue of a Guardian, that you have the fashion reporting of the new trend and the 15 most important coats this winter and whatever, and any label, and then you have this critical journalism as well. And I'm just wondering, do you have discussions, or what do the theme conferences around the fashion table look like?
Well, I could give you an example from food, then I'll talk about fashion, but just because food came into my head, we have columnists. George Monbiot is one of our columnists, and he often writes about, as a newspaper, if we care about sustainability, why have we got all these recipes full of meat and shellfish and unsustainable, telling you to buy cod or buy out-of-season ingredients? So there's a kind of a discussion that goes on. I haven't seen it so much in terms of the fashion, but there certainly is that sort of dichotomy between, here you go, here's 10 trends every single week, feeling that obligation to do 10 coats you should buy, 10 trousers you should buy, alongside articles that's like, where did your trousers come from? A really bad place. I mean, that's really difficult, and I think that probably comes to the sort of the fundamentals of what is fashion journalism and what should we be doing, and there's a demand for that kind of journalism. So do you say, do you know what, even though you want this, we're not going to give it to you anymore, or do you say we are going to try our best to promote products that have those ethical credentials? And that's something that The Guardian's doing much, much more of. I mean, Lucy Siegel, who's the kind of eco-fashion columnist, does a lot around this topic, and she is very expert in it, in both fashion, and I think she's quite unique in that. And I think there is that movement towards which are the brands that we should be talking about, who should we be kind of telling our audience about. But yes, it's still not you know, it's not perfect.
Okay, are there any more questions from the audience, or?
Can I ask a question to the audience?
Yes, sure.
I would be interested what you expect from fashion journalism. Well, what's from your point of view, what's the lack when you read magazines? What are you looking for?
Well, there's so many different things that you could have, but one that comes to mind is it's nice to have articles about particular craft and people who are really good at doing something. But usually these tend to be, you know, here's the feather worker in Paris, you know, who works for the couture, who does something very beautiful. But around the world, you also find amazing craftsmanship, you know, people who are hand spinning and dyeing and weaving and doing ikat. It would be nice to have highlights to some of those, as well as information about how designers in the West might be able to develop relationships with particular craftspeople. Because it's so frustrating, even some of the best, coolest designers, you know, they'll do a sort of something with ikat or batik, but it's fake. And you think, but, you know, if you could make a connection with someone in Uzbekistan or Indonesia, you could get real ikat and real handmade batik. And that would make the value of the garment so much better.
The articles I like to read the most as of late are the ones who are linked to politics or what's happening in the world. I think the link of fashion being a seasonal medium, it has an opportunity to be directly linked to current events that's not so often exploited, so not so often investigated. So, for example, what this politician is wearing during that speech and how this could influence the audiences, that's a kind of article that maybe because there's been more of those recently because of all that's happening, but until a few years ago there weren't many, so that's what I'm interested in now. Yeah.
I would like to read more about young fashion designers, especially graduate fashion designers from universities and school. In Germany right now, there's nothing about graduates or young fashion designers to read in no magazine, so this maybe would be one thing I would like to have.
I would also like to add that more creatives and producers of color should be included, because fashion journalism and reporting is still predominantly white and male, even though there's a lack of female designers being promoted as well, as I feel, and people of color, other marginalized groups, creatives in locations not usually associated as like fashion centers. Yes, so just to shift the focus towards other areas as well.
I was very happy what Aya said, because I'm educator in fashion, but I'm also a fashion designer. And I think really the fashion designers need a voice. I know no fashion designer who really likes to write about his work. So that's maybe in other disciplines like architecture less the problem. And so I think it's very, very important that journalism is very, very connected to the designer, because the designer's voice today is very weak. It's in the last 20 years, it is completely the responsibility of the designer and his own voice being overwhelmed by marketing and stylists. And I think it's really important that there is a close connection in between journalism and the designers.
I think that's a really good point, and I think I'd like to add to that. It's also why I think to say, don't ask for a fact check or don't ask to read the article is maybe a little bit of a dangerous one. I'm one of those designers I actually always ask to read an article that's being written, because so much crap is being written about the work that you do. You want to contextualize it. You want to your work not to be used as a token of sustainability or 3D printing or et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one thing I would definitely tell the students here or people that start out. Always ask for your article to be written or to be read before it gets published. I think that's just a little point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think this is a wonderful basis to have a final round on the panel to wrap up a bit. And on the basis of this, now you know what the audience expects from you. I would like to ask you to look a bit into the future and maybe, tell us what should or how should fashion journalism look like in the near future, taking on board all these recommendations from your audience. Who wants to start?
Wow. Okay. I guess it's about developing, it's carrying on with that feeling of joy, developing a narrative around clothes and design, encouraging that relationship with what you wear, as much as what I was saying about your grandmother's jacket or something, having a meaning in what you wear. I think that's important in terms of thinking about how you consume and moving towards more sort of slow fashion. It would be really interesting to see what happens around that. I think that's important. I think the narrative around the environment, around social impact, that still needs to come through. For me, that's really important because it's an inherent part of fashion, as it is with so many other industries. Again, I'm not singling out fashion as being the worst. But I think those kind of themes are really important, and in the future we'll hopefully see more of.
I think what in my mind is clear now after this panel discussion, after what you said, the topic fashion journalism and the topics we write about and work about are so wide and so broad. So I think, many journalists are still lonely fighters. So I think what would be really important would be that journalists team up. That, for example, I work together with someone who has really, background knowledge on technology when it comes to sustainability or to production circles from China. I have no idea about China. So I think journalists really should work together more with different backgrounds, team up and provide even more effective and high quality journalism. So I think this lonely fighter mentality should come to an end maybe.
I think that one idea that I like is to move from a to-buy communication to a to-wear communication, instead of a shopping list or a 5 items to buy, more of how to wear this. And this is a subtle shift, and it won't necessarily annoy advertisers, because it's just a question of perception and communication. But how often do we see, this amazing new piece from the new season, here is what you could combine it with that you already might have in your closet from last season, or this amazing piece, it's so great, not just because how it looks, but how it feels on the body, and you will want to wear it for eternity, or this, more communicate on this personal relationship that everybody has with clothes, instead of the thrill of buying something.
I would like for fashion journalism to be more self-critical, to develop an auto-critique, and also to develop a better evaluative vocabulary.
Okay, so thank you very much.